We are just letting everybody in right now. Okay, I'm closing the waiting room so you people can, oops, I did not mean to mute you, Edward. Okay. All right. We are recording. So hey, everybody. I'm Jen Walling, the Executive Director of the Illinois Environmental Council, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this Lunch and Learn. It's part of our series that we have been doing since March, and we're hoping these sessions keep you connected during this difficult time, and we're making them publicly available. Everything will be up on our website and on our YouTube, so this will be an exciting presentation. Since our founding in 1975 by a group of dedicated grassroots environmentalists, IEC has led issue advocacy campaigns by allowing environmental organizations like many on the call today to pool their resources and create a higher profile for environmental issues. In hitting a new milestone, IEC represents over 100 environmental and community organizations throughout the state of Illinois. So if you're interested in membership, either individual or affiliate, let me know. And so I do want, I know today we're very sick of Zoom meetings, but if folks could, just for a second, we'd love it if you would turn your camera on if you can, not everybody, but if you can turn your camera on, we're gonna take a little bit of like a class picture today, for some of our social media. So we'll just give that 1 minute and then I'm going to introduce you to the presenters. We have some great folks today. This is fabulous. So Tucker, you got it? You taking some pictures? Everybody smile. Cool. All right, we got what we need there. Tucker, you getting more? We're trying to get everybody we can. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining. You're welcome to turn your camera up if you want or hang out with our great presenters here. So I'm really pleased to introduce our topic today that we are going to be talking about, the piping plovers. And we have two really excellent conservation folks on today. I know that this has been a really exciting topic and very hopeful for us throughout the state of Illinois. So we have Edward Warden, who's from the Chicago Ornithological Society, and his day job is the Conservation Stewardship Coordinator at Shedd Aquarium. And then Matthew, who is with the Illinois Ornithological Society and Bird Conservation Network. And his day job is at Lincoln Park Zoo. These are incredibly talented folks in the conservation field who are going to talk to us today about this topic that I think they said, I think it's super hopeful and I know I need some hope right now. So thank you for presenting today. So I'll pitch it off to you guys.
All right, great. So I'm hoping at this moment you can see my screen, which looks like a couple plovers. Okay, good. All right, so thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Matt Igleski right now, and then Edward. We're both currently presidents of our organizations, but have been involved with them for several years. So we're gonna do our best to talk about piping plovers. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of a background, and then we're gonna dive into the more, bigger details from this last couple years. So if you're not that familiar with piping plovers are a small shorebird, a plover, which means they have a short little bill. They run around on the sand, and they're generally looking for different insects, and they really prefer this sort of like kind of marginal habitat between like the open sandy areas into these like kind of sparsely vegetated habitats. And that's usually where you're going to see them. And that's actually those kinds of areas are where they're going to nest as well. And so they're going to nest usually almost like where it's a little bit rocky. So they don't really prefer the really sandy beach. They kind of like those like cobbly, kind of like gravelly beaches. And you can see that, I'll go back one actually. You can see that one, they blend in really well with the sand. So we always describe them as being sort of dry sand colored. So that's one way you can identify a piping plover versus a very similar semi-palmated plover. And then you can see their eggs also blend in very well. And so this is a very typical nest for a plover. There's not much to it. It's just like a little divot in the beach, and then they lay their eggs. There's actually 3 populations of plovers, or of piping plovers. So there's Great Plains, there's a Great Lakes, and there's an Atlantic population. And so the red area on this map is where they are during the breeding time. And then during the winter, they all kind of like come together along the Gulf Coast, and you can see up into some of the Carolinas along those beaches. And then there are some populations that go down into Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. So there's three populations. And so historically, the Great Lakes population has always been small. So it's been the smallest of the 3. At its peak, probably was maybe a couple thousand plovers, so maybe 800 pairs, all spread throughout all the Great Lakes. But in 1983, we were down to just 12 pairs. So you can see that's pretty dire. That's not very many birds. That's less than 30 out in the wild. And they were pretty restricted to some of especially the island areas in northern Lake Michigan, which tends to be sort of the stronghold even today for this population. And so 3 years after that, in 1986, U.S. Fish and Wildlife listed them as federally threatened. So that was the Atlantic and Great Lakes Great Plains populations. And the Great Lakes population was then federally endangered. So they're still federally endangered today. So there's, there's a distinction there between the populations being threatened or endangered, not just the species itself. So our population is endangered. And that's due to a lot of reasons. Pretty much anytime you look at something being federally endangered, habitat loss is going to be number one. So habitat loss for these guys is a big issue. And it's really due to like shoreline development, recreational use of the beaches, a lot of shoreline armoring. So a lot of people don't want their beaches to erode away. So they dump a bunch of really big rocks on the shoreline, and that totally changes the habitat and makes it, not appealing to a piping plover. And then there are predators that tend to increase in population, especially in association with humans, especially things like raccoons and gulls and crows, and they'll eat the adults and the eggs if they can get to them. So a recovery plan was developed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife in 2003. And so the goal now is to get them back up to about 150 pairs over a 5-year period. So that's the goal, and that's still the goal today. And so how do they do that? So protecting nesting areas is one way. So they protect the beaches. And if you've gone to any of these places where the plovers nest, you'll see these signs up and ropes up to keep people out. And so that's one way. And another way is to protect the nests themselves. And so Fish and Wildlife will go out, and once a plover has decided on a nest, they'll actually put another barrier, what we call an exclosure, right over that nesting area. And so the holes are big enough, obviously, for the adults to go back in and out, but it keeps out some of those other predators like raccoons and skunks and, crows and things like that from coming down and eating the eggs. They've seen a huge amount of success doing the exclosures. So the exclosures, the hatch success went from 35 to 90%. So the plovers are at least hatching, which is good. That's half the battle when you're raising babies. And then the other interesting part of this program that has been developed is that they will actually even salvage eggs if they get abandoned by their parents. So if parents, abandon the nest or get eaten, which is often the case, why they would be abandoning the nest. Also high lake levels in recent years, these last couple of years, have been washing out nests. And so if there are volunteer monitors from Fish and Wildlife all throughout the Great Lakes region, and if they notice something like that, and they can salvage the eggs, they'll go here, which is the University of Michigan Biological Station. And there's this hand rearing facility that is actually mostly manned by zookeepers from different parts of the country that'll come here and help, a lot of them from Michigan, since this is in northern Michigan. So between those two main parts of, assisting the plovers, the exclosures and the captive rearing, you can see on this, the number of pairs are going up. So this is the number of pairs on the y-axis and dates and the years on the bottom. And so you can see that once they started doing both of those, the number of pairs really went up. And so now we're currently, this is a couple years old now, but We're currently at about 70 pairs. I think I actually read recently we might even be up closer to 80, 79 pairs, spread through every single Great Lake, which was not the case just a few years ago. I think there's one pair holding down all of Lake Erie, and just a few up in the UP. There's probably more on Lake Superior that maybe people don't get to, just because that's a big extensive shoreline with not a lot of people monitoring it. But you know, we're getting there. We're at like, you know, half of what the goal would be to delisting. And so in recent years, we've actually even seen them in Illinois. So we have, you know, a pretty small chunk of the shoreline, but we have seen a few piping plovers here. And so recent nesting attempts have included basically just 4. I'm burying the lead because we're going to obviously talk about the last couple of years. But before that, there were 4 nesting attempts between 2009 and 2016. The Illinois State Beach Park had a couple nesting attempts. Johns Manville had a couple nesting attempts, which Edward told me yesterday or the day before that is a super fun site. So they're, you know, not picky as long as the right habitat is there. In 2009, the nests were abandoned and the eggs were salvaged, but they did end up fledging 3 chicks in Michigan and releasing them. And then in 2015, 4 chicks fledged at one of the other nesting sites, but the male parent was killed by a peregrine falcon. So the other 2 nesting attempts of the 4 completely failed. And you can see that these 2 ones that were kind of successful still did not have adults present to continue on. So we just haven't had a sustained effort of breeding in Illinois. We've had a lot of attempts, but nothing that's lasted more than a year. Fast forward to 2018, we have 2 plovers that show up at Waukegan in one of the nicest gravel parking lots of all of the Great Lakes here, full of these barriers. There's actually a huge colony of gulls nearby, which I mentioned earlier, kind of a predator for these guys, but they're not bothered by it. It's pretty high human activity, but the plovers seem to be doing a great job of just kind of hanging out in this gravel lot. And, you know, after a little while, they lay a nest. The nest was smack dab in the middle of this gravel parking lot. For those familiar with Waukegan, this is like the main parking lot to go out to the beach. There's a lot of events out here. They did rope it off at first, and then what happened was I think they just got nervous about leaving the nest out there and eventually salvaged the eggs. And I believe 1 chick fledged from this nesting attempt. In the eyes of the plovers, though, a failed attempt because they lost their eggs. They never got to see the fruition of their nesting efforts. So are they going to come back? We don't know. Well, fast forward another year to 2019, then we have 2 plovers that show up at Montrose. And so at Montrose, we end up with these 2 plovers, Monty and Rose. Monty, you can tell Monty by his green and orange band here. Green on the right, orange on the left. And so what's interesting about the Great Lakes Piping Plovers is there's the Great Lakes Piping Plover Project, which goes around and bands every single plover that they can with a unique combination of bands and marks on the band so that we can tell like exactly where they came from. So Monty came from a hatch in 2017 in Silver Lake State Park in Michigan. And then we also have a female that shows up at Montrose, Rose, now affectionately known as Rose, with a blue band on her right leg and an orange band on the left. And she also hatched in Michigan in 2017 at Muskegon State Park, which is a pretty busy state park beach in Michigan. So these 2 plovers show up. We're very interested in their history. The great thing about the Great Lakes Piping Plover Project is if you get good documentation of the bands, you can send them an email and say, hey, what's the history of these plovers? And so when we start going back to the history of the plovers, we actually find out these are the 2 plovers from Waukegan. So the 2 that attempted to nest at Waukegan the year before. And if we go even further back another year, they were even spotted at Waukegan in their fledge year. So they hatched in Michigan, wandered around a little bit, ended up in Waukegan in August of 2017, and then came right back to that site the next year. So that's, some evidence that these birds might be kind of scoping out places on their very first year of migration after they hatch, and they came back to Waukegan. Of course, like I said, those eggs were recovered and incubated, and so they didn't, the birds themselves didn't know if that was a successful attempt. So now they're back here at Montrose. And that 2019 year, they actually did go back and forth a little bit between Montrose and Waukegan, but it eventually settled on Montrose. And what we started noticing, especially because Montrose is such a heavily birded area, there's a lot of people there looking for birds every single day. And so we started noticing all these behaviors from these birds. They were nest scraping, which basically means the male's going around making all these divots in the sand for the female to sort of, you know, scope out and decide on whether or not that's, you know, the one that she wants to use. We saw lots and lots of mating. People got great videos of this. There's all sorts of different parts of the process where the male kind of does all these step things and then he jumps on her back. So we knew that these birds had seemed to have chosen Montrose as a nesting site. So that was really, really fun and exciting because we hadn't had, you know, piping plovers will come by in migration, but we hadn't had any trying to nest here for a long, long time. So as soon as that was happening, there were people, because like we said, this is a pretty heavily birded area, people noticing all this happening and started to sort of call around and ask like, who's gonna help maybe come out and just kind of watch these birds once in a while, because it's a really visible area. It's really high traffic on Montrose. There's people, there's dogs, there's bicycles, Frisbee leagues. There's just all sorts of stuff, a lot of, you know, commotion at the site. So we wanted to sort of just figure out if there was a way to sort of monitor them. And so at first the organization of the effort was just literally call any birder that we can find that's willing to come out and watch them for a while, and just kind of see what happens with these birds, see, you know, to see if they're successful. And so 2 days after that, the first egg is laid. Rose decides on a spot. And so you can see this is a good example of a piping plover sitting on the nest. It's easy to see them when they're this close, but when you're a little ways away, they just blend right in. You don't even notice that they're there. So after they laid the egg and they were starting to sit, U.S. Fish and Wild came out and put an exclosure, and then they even put a camera up, which was really interesting, so that they could monitor the nest even when they weren't there. And so on the 12th, so this is about 6 days after that first egg is laid, there's a big storm coming. And so if you're familiar at all with Montrose, you know that it's often very flooded, especially the last few years with the higher waters levels in Lake Michigan. And just so you can see in this photo where the nest is sort of like kind of to the bottom middle right corner. I should have put something on here, in that sandy area. So you can see it's like not very visible at all, but those signs, those barriers, you can kind of see the ropes. That indicates the whole area where that's roped off for those plovers to be. And so on the 12th, everyone's out there kind of wondering what's going to happen with the storm. There's a lot of winds coming from the north really, really strongly. And if you've ever been anywhere or familiar with sustained winds on Lake Michigan, these events called seiches happen where the water gets pushed all the way down to one end of the lake. And that was sort of what was being predicted. And so lo and behold, the next day, oh, it is on there. That's where the nest is. The next day, that whole area is completely flooded. So that nest is washed out. There's no way that nest would have survived. So, but fortunately, Fish and Wildlife decided, hey, let's pull those eggs. Let's send them up to the biological station. And so they did get housed at Lincoln Park Zoo for a little while. So the bird zookeepers there took care of them for about a week and then brought them up to the University of Michigan Biological Station. This nest ultimately failed, you know, for a variety of reasons. No one really knows why. But there was a second nesting attempt. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Edward to talk a little bit about the second nesting attempt.
All right, give me a second to pull up my screen here.
And feel free to use the chat at any time to ask questions. I'll try to monitor the chat while Edward's talking.
Okay. Get to the presentation mode. Wait for it. Okay, everybody see my screen now?
Yep.
All good? Okay, awesome. So, oh God, oh, what a tragic story. What's going to become of our brave plovers? Clearly, their decision-making as far as nesting locations was maybe always a little bit suspect to begin with. First and foremost in gravel parking lots, and then in an already highly flood-prone area. However, they did make a second nesting attempt. And this new nest was much, much higher upland. It was a lot closer to the natural area dunes that are marked out in that space. And was just generally, from both a human and plover perspective, a far superior nesting location. Turns out that they had to hop around a little bit. There were several new scrapes that they made trying to figure out where they wanted to go. They ended up closer to the actual dunes themselves, kind of in the colony of the bank swallows. And you can sort of make it out in this photo here, those sort of holes in the wall there. That's where other birds, these birds called bank swallows, are also burrowing out their nests, which actually is another bird of conservation concern that is utilizing Montrose. But it didn't take too long. They hopped around, scraped some new scrapes, and lo and behold, we had a new nest with 4 beautiful little eggs popped in there, right where that red circle is along the wall with this bank swallow colony. This is also incidentally exactly where the volleyball courts used to be. So, you know, again, we had to sort of intervene a little bit. Some of the volleyball nets were removed to give them a little bit of space. The area was fenced off, and volunteer monitoring began. Now, as Matt pointed out earlier, there were a lot of threats to nests under normal circumstances in the very natural settings. They already face a lot of threats, whether that's flooding, predators, etc. In an urban environment like Montrose, at the busiest beach in the largest city on the Great Lakes, all of those threats were amplified. So obviously we have, you know, other birds like grackles, which is a kind of blackbird, gulls, crows, herons, which, you know, yeah, we think of them as fish eaters, but they'll eat anything that they can get their beaks on. Falcons, Chicago's official city bird is the peregrine falcon. We have a very strong falcon population here, which is something to be proud of, but in this particular context was something to be very concerned about. And then also mammals, skunks, which could burrow into the nest, raccoons, even possums, all kinds of things. Plus, then there's just the invisible threats. Botulism, which is something that does hit areas of the Great Lakes from time to time due to dead animals in the water, is a known killer of plovers from time to time. Plus, just the fact that this is an area where there's a lot of other competition with other maybe birds like killdeer, which is a kind of plover that also nests in comparable areas. And yeah, again, those human threats as well. Off-leash dogs are a very common thing at Montrose Beach. Just straight up fireworks from 4th of July and other noise pollution. Humans, the volleyball courts, and I don't know if anybody recalls the Mambi on the Beach concert that was slated to take place on the beach itself. I mean, literally yards from where they were nesting. So there was a lot of potential threats going on in this space that had to be addressed or dealt with, or at the very least kept an eye on while these birds were attempting to raise their family. And here's a couple images here. Like Matt mentioned earlier, again, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, USDA, and IDNR all work together to put up cameras on these nests, one on the nest itself and one a little farther away, to really kind of demonstrate the kinds of threats that we were facing in the nest, even when volunteers weren't there keeping an eye on it. So skunks, dog, and despite all of that, this is where you cue the aw. I can't hear you guys, but I'm assuming that's what's happening there. Is eggs hatching. We got some beautiful little fluff balls on, you know, basically toothpicks here running around on the beach, and they all hatched within just a couple of days of each other. And all of a sudden we had these little guys running around the beach, which was fantastic, getting past that first hatching stage, and was also then extra nightmare for the volunteers, because now we don't just have this one sedentary nest to look after, but all of these plover chicks plus 2 adults running around on the beach trying to keep track of where they're all going and making sure they're all safe and protected. Some more all-worthy photos here. Look at those little guys. Meanwhile, while obviously volunteers are a big part of the success of Monty and Rose's first year, they were no slackers either. Monty and Rose both did a fantastic job partnering off, pushing out predators from their space, whether that was gulls, to competition with those killdeer we mentioned, and, you know, along with the remote control truck that IDNR had to help scare off gulls, Monty and Rose did a very fantastic job of driving everything out that was a potential threat and keeping an eye on those babies and giving them the best chance that they had. So we did lose one chick for unknown reasons, whether it was botulism or something else. We couldn't tell for sure. It was some kind of disease potentially, but we still managed to get two to fully fledge, grow out their flight feathers, and fly out of Chicago and successfully basically become adults, which is fantastic because that alone already beats the average for most plover nest success rates. So this was a fantastic thing. It was the first time this has happened since 1955. The last nest that was documented in Chicago was down in the Wolf Lake area. So, I mean, with all of the threats that were present, human and non-human, and the fact that this is just, it was a major capstone for the recovery program as a whole, not just for Chicago conservation. It was a really exciting time to really say, man, if we can do that here, really, we can do that anywhere. And the effort itself was actually a massive coalition. First and foremost, we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who coordinates the Endangered Species Program. You had Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who then led the chief efforts here in the state, and also USDA, who contributed some resources as well, like the cameras to help monitor the nests. Then there was the birding organizations, Illinois Ornithological, Chicago Ornithological, and Chicago Audubon, that all came together, honestly, in a way that we hadn't even really done before, to coordinate that volunteer effort. And this also includes the Chicago Park District, their security force, and even the Chicago Police Department, who all came together for the purpose of seeing these birds through their entire year of season of fledging. And when we put the call out there for volunteers, we really had no idea what was going to happen. We put together a little graphic, just a volunteer alert, come help these plovers, and what we got was phenomenal. We got just shy of 200 people who dedicated their time to come out and help these birds succeed. And you know, most of them were not even what they would say, they said themselves, consider themselves birders, so to speak. A lot of them were just people who heard about these really cool species on this beach, you know, these two little birds versus the world, and wanted to come out and help. And so the result was shifts that were basically from dawn till dusk every day of that summer. Each shift usually had at least 2 or more volunteers, some keeping an eye on the plovers, some doing volunteer engagement, some basically being a volleyball bouncer. And it was just this whole effort that came together pretty much on its own. We just put the ask out there, and it was just phenomenal, the amount of outpouring of support and effort that people wanted to put into seeing these birds succeed. I mean, I've worked with volunteers in a lot of different capacities, both professionally and personally, and this is to this day still one of the most dramatic and last-minute volunteer efforts I've ever seen come together. And I mean, that really truly spanned everybody from young and old, all weather. You see it on the bottom right there. I mean, that is a downpour that was happening that day, cats and dogs, but they were out there still keeping an eye on those birds, even as the sun was setting. And obviously our little man up here at the top, our future Plover Watch volunteer. 2020 looked a little bit different, to say the least. After 2019, we were feeling very good about ourselves. We were very excited. All right, you know what? We've got this down. We've got a system. 2020, we're going to knock it out of the park. Well, and then things happened, as we all know that they did. And naturally, beaches were closed all across the city. In general, we were all staying home. The kinds and types of threats that we were expecting for 2020 did not happen. And honestly, one of the biggest threats was just, while people were not allowed on the beach, what was happening out there when we weren't watching. Eventually, we did confirm, however, that they returned in 2020. They came to the same space that they successfully nested in last year and successfully hatched 4 eggs. By that point, it was clear that volunteers were needed on the beach, so volunteers were allowed in limited numbers to come out to the beach to keep an eye on the plovers post-hatching. And the result was, again, we actually got 3 to successfully fledge this year. Again, one of them didn't make it for unknown reasons, unfortunately. But again, 3 plovers is beating the odds by quite a bit. So between having the beaches closed this year, and I guess what people are dubbing the anthropause, and having the support of volunteers again, many of which were all volunteers from the previous year, from last year, who were still engaged and excited to come out, made a huge difference. And on top of that, we were able to do something in 2020 we weren't able to do in 2019. I'll get to that in just a minute, putting that teaser out there. But the biggest thing that really we'd love to highlight as well is just how much this became an engagement opportunity for conservation, for endangered species, like nothing else. The biggest thing was that while we were out there, especially in 2019, we were talking to hundreds of people a day. who were just casually asking, what are you guys looking at? What's going on here? What's a piping plover? What is this weird grassy area that I'm looking at? And all of a sudden, we had people coming from across the city who utilized this massive beach, who were here to ask questions and learn about conservation in some form or another. And as a result, a whole community emerged. We had people from across the city, beyond just the birding organizations, other organizations who wanted to hop in and do their part and help, and if nothing else, just get the word out about this fantastic, success story that was happening right here in the heart of our city. The result was that we had people who are, made new friendships, people who became members of new conservation organizations, people who maybe never considered themselves birders or conservationists, suddenly calling themselves birders or nature lovers of some kind or another. And the result as well was also a sort of extra layer of that community. T-shirts emerged. There's a Piping Plover beer now. There was a feature-length documentary made about Monty and Rose. And the best part too is that there's a Monty Rose 2 in production that is, I believe Illinois Environmental Council is actually supporting to get it through its final stage of production here. So really, truly, the amount of just interest and excitement that these birds generated, both on the beach and well beyond throughout the city, I mean, was incredible. I know a lot of people also got excited about Chance the Snapper Gator in Humboldt Park, but I think these guys are really what kind of captured people's hearts and imagination and just what is possible to accomplish and do in this city in a garden. And there's my teaser. We were actually able to band the 3 plover chicks that hatched this year. In 2019, the decision was made not to band the 2 chicks that successfully fledged because a lot of things were unknown. There was still a lot of stressors and problems on the beach. We didn't want to basically stress those birds to the point where maybe they wouldn't make it because of our actions and intervention. So the decision was made for the 2019 chicks to go do their thing, do the best that they could to survive, and not involve ourselves. But in 2020, with things so different, we were able to see those 3 chicks banded. So each one of them now has a unique identity. We had the opportunity to give them names, and they also have a new color-coded band for Chicago-specific birds. So all piping plovers that are now born in Chicago going forward will have a purple leg band denoting that they are a Chicago or Illinois-born bird, which is really exciting progress in the overall program. What was also exciting about this too was that we saw an opportunity to continue to build that community that I've been talking about. So in the process of picking these names, instead of just sort of talking amongst ourselves and throwing a dart at the board, we decided to basically have a city-wide option to vote on these names. So what we did is we actually reached out to partners, bird interests or not, that we felt were representative of as many communities within Chicago as we could reach. This meant reaching out to a lot of different groups that maybe aren't traditionally considered conservation groups, but maybe represented communities that are underrepresented or other basically regions within the city that aren't just a bunch of bird nerds hanging around in Lincoln Park. And the result was that we had over 300 submissions for potential names for the birds. And they ranged everything from the serious, for example, Hazel, which is named after Hazel Johnson, who's considered one of the first environmental justice figures and a big figure in the Chicago environmental scene, to the not so serious, like multiple votes for deep dish and hot dog. So we got the whole gamut of names suggested to us, but what we ended up doing was going back to several community leaders that we recruited to select these names, make sure that we were being as thoughtful and sensitive in that selection process as possible. And we came up with these 3 names, which we felt really kind of hit a lot of different facets and aspects to the Chicago community as a whole. And we're able to continue to build that community and investment in these birds and conservation from a citywide perspective. And the last thing here is just to talk about how this was a vision in the making. Natural areas in Chicago parks is relatively new still. Montrose Beach is one of the first natural areas within the Chicago Park District, and it itself is only just over 20 years old. The result, though, was that because of dedicated volunteers who saw the possibilities and the potential to just start growing a few plants, keeping that, beachcomber from reaching that one corner of the beach, to planting a few trees. And over the time, a slow slog from high lake levels to low lake levels, seeing this habitat slowly emerge to the point where all of a sudden it wasn't just common plants, it was uncommon plants, uncommon species, to rare and threatened, to straight up endangered. In a lot of ways, these piping plovers are not just a success story for the program as a whole, but also reflective of just how far we can go in terms of building that garden within our city here, that natural and wild garden, because piping plovers in a lot of ways are the sort of peak of the ecology. They really represent, if you're able to successfully have this highly sensitive, threatened, endangered species in this space successfully living out its life cycle, that is about as good confirmation as possible, showing that this habitat, this thing we call habitat restoration, works. It's special. And it really is a testament to how we should be continuing to look at this and say, we should be conserving more. We should be looking at our habitats and our natural spaces and our park spaces and looking at how we utilize them and continue to expand natural spaces for species like this. The big reason why plovers in the Great Lakes don't have habitat is because of us. So it really kind of falls to us to continue to look for ways to create spaces for them once again. And I think that's all I've got here for our slideshow. If you'd like to visit, we have a brand new website, chicagopipingplovers.org, where you can get updates about, well, Chicago's piping plovers. There's a blog there with updates that happen in real time, as well as just further information about these birds in general. You can also email the Plover Watch team at that above email address, as well as both Matt and myself, whose email addresses are listed there.
Great. Thank you all. And anybody should feel free to ask questions, but IEC, in our role, we have a really strong advocacy bent, and we represent, in fact, both Chicago and Illinois Ornithological Society are members, and we're very pleased to lobby on behalf of organizations like that. What do you think from a policy and advocacy perspective? What are the biggest things that you think people can do to make sure that efforts like this succeed even more?
Become a member of IEC.
Thank you.
Well, I think, one of the big things is habitat, obviously, for this species, but so many others. Piping plovers are just kind of a great representation of so many other species in our state and region that need quality habitats to survive and continue doing what they're doing. So I know IAC and a whole host of other organizations are working on the 30 by 30 project to basically protect 30% of all habitat by 2030. It's a very ambitious goal, but that's, for example, a fantastic start, a very clear policy goal that a lot of people are asking for and is really hot right now, that could really do wonders for species like this. Matt, you got something?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's habitat. Habitat's the hardest thing to maintain for some of these species, and so there's a lot of different types of habitat that get overlooked. Shorebird habitat is one of them. I think shorebird habitat is not a sexy habitat to people. The plovers are, the Great Lakes the piping plovers are a little bit different, because I think piping plovers, they're the sandy, the sparsely, vegetated areas. But a lot of other shorebirds utilize sort of mud flats, just habitats that we don't think of. We tend to sort of put things into categories like grassland, forest, wetland might be the other one that's sort of always hard to sort of maintain. And a lot of those habitats get erased and they're very difficult to recreate. And so I think, yeah, just paying attention to what kind of habitats you have and wherever you're at, and helping preserve them is going to be probably the biggest thing that's going to help a lot of these species. And then timing of things, like we were talking about with the plovers, just being aware of the timing of when they're nesting. And so the concert on the beach thing happening much later might be okay, might be less disruptive. We're in a big city. There's always going to have to be some kind of compromise. And the same thing goes for even grassland birds, where a lot of times if it's just mowing those kinds of areas at different times can be a really critical difference for how these birds survive. And so I think those are all the kinds of things that we really need to really be all attentive of. And, joining whatever bird club you have so that you can pay attention to their Facebook pages and have them sort of help you know like what to pay attention to. There's a lot of great resources out there, and I follow a lot of stuff just on Facebook and Twitter to get that kind of information.
I see Judy is plugging that in the chat as well.
Yeah, and Judy helped set this up from Chicago Audubon Society. So thank you, Judy, for everything you're doing too.
Yeah.
And Andrew from Open Lands posted a few resources in the comments there. Folks should feel free to ask any other questions. You can go beyond plovers too, like what other bird things you want to ask about. So we'll give people some minutes there, but oh, here. I heard that there was an outbreak of botulism in Green Bay that caused a relocation of a number of plovers. Did any of these birds survive? Were any relocated to Illinois?
Yeah, as far as I know, they did relocate some to northern, like I think in the Waukegan or Illinois State Beach area. I don't know yet if anyone knows for sure if they survived or not. Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. Like, you know, the band colors are good for obviously identifying individuals when you see them and when they get reported, but it's often very difficult for us to get a lot of information unless people are reporting them. Fortunately, this year, I see another question, which is kind of leading to where I was going to say, fortunately, this year, we do have good information that Esperanza, Niche, and Hazel all made it down to the Gulf Coast because people reported the band colors from down there. So we know all three of them made it. Rose is usually detected somewhere, I think in Florida, if I remember correctly. Monty hardly ever gets detected on his winter ground. So I don't know if we really know where he goes. He might be going to Mexico, which I guess the Great Lakes Piping Plover, I think team was saying, oh, they don't get a lot of reports from that area, from the Yucatan. So it's possible he's down in that area. But yeah, I mean, you know, that's one of the things too, that anytime you see one of these birds, if you have so many of us now, at least that are birders, carry like these big, huge cameras, we can usually get really good photos or really good documentation. And if you get that kind of documentation, like, just send an email to the Great Lakes Piping Plover recovery people and they'll respond pretty fast to let you know if those birds made it somewhere. But if you follow them on Facebook too, I think they usually do a pretty good job of updating everybody about when a bird is reported. And I bet they're going to be tracking those Wisconsin birds pretty closely to see if they make it down there.
Yeah, and I think I would emphasize once again, maybe you weren't a Plover Watch volunteer per se, but there's a lot of different ways that you can support. And I mean, so much of this program from the top to the bottom is supported by just everyday people, birder or not, sending in your observations, asking questions and making, your interests known. So yeah, because we wouldn't know where the heck these birds end up if it wasn't for people just reporting them and giving us that important data about places where they winter and places that they can need conserved and taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
Rose spent the winter on Anclote Key off Clearwater, where I spend the winter, and she was sighted there in 2018 as well.
Did you get to see her?
Didn't get to see her, but I talked to the guy who did. He took a picture.
Nice.
Thanks Alice for putting she put the Plover email for University of Minnesota Piping Plover project in there so that you can email and ask about band colors if you see them. And then she also gave us the scoop because I couldn't remember. Hazel and Esperanza are in Georgia and Niche is in Florida. So all three of them are down there.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, we have not heard from either Monty or Rose this year yet.
Not yet.
Cool. So there were a few more. I'll ask both of them. Do the hand-raised chicks get released and succeed? And how do they survive the hurricanes?
The hand-raised chicks do get released and they do succeed. So from where the University of Michigan biostation is, there's a few places that they often will try to, I think, release the chicks as close as possible to where the nest was salvaged, but sometimes they just get released, in pairs or something at some sites that they know are good. I think actually, to be honest, I know Alice is on this call. I bet she probably knows better than I do. I think Platte Point, there's some places around there where the chicks get released. And we know that we've seen chicks come back from those hand-released, they're the hand-reared chicks. So we know that they're definitely getting back and forth, even though they're getting hand-released. I mean, I think the interesting thing about plovers is that the parents leave. So even with our Great Lakes, our Chicago ones, Monty and Rose take off and the babies stick around. So like the parents are not leading them to their wintering grounds. It's an innate thing where they start heading south and they make it, or they don't. And so it's not necessarily something where they need the parents to show them. So that, you know, even though we release them without the parents nearby, they seem to be just fine and make it to their wintering grounds, which I think is really interesting. How do they survive hurricanes? You know, hurricanes have been around for a long time. I don't know. I'm always amazed at how many birds show up after a big rain or even a torrential downpour. You know, they go and they hide somewhere. You know, the nests maybe wouldn't survive if it was a big hurricane during breeding season, but the parents are usually pretty good about finding, even, you know, that flooding event we had at Montrose, the parents kind of just figure out a place to go and kind of know when to cut their losses.
Yeah, I mean, like Matt said, they've evolved for a very long time to deal with these kinds of circumstances and environments. And, you know, I know one doesn't think of a sandy beach as a particularly resilient space, but if you're in a place where there's decent habitat, some like high quality dunes, or even like I guess in some places even mangroves, you know, just any kind of shoreline habitat that's in good ecological health, those are pretty resilient spaces. You can find some pretty decent places to hide, especially if you're a small, easily tucked away bird.
I see a question about some in Minnesota in an interior lakeshore. I mean, often it's not piping plovers that are interior, not the Great Lakes piping plovers. They're almost always nesting. I don't even actually know of any that don't nest right along like a Great Lake and those shoreline habitats. But there are a lot of other plovers that look similar where it could be possible. I'm not really sure in Minnesota like what other species would be breeding, but semi-palmated plovers are similar. Killdeer are also another one that are much more generalist when it comes to where they'll breed. Like we often will see killdeer in sort of like big open fields or, oh, okay. So Alice is on point right now. Thank you, Alice. So yeah, a record of Lake of the Woods in Minnesota. So, okay. So there is an interior record for the Great Lakes piping plover.
It's also
population.
not unheard of, you know, for these birds to move around a lot, especially, you know, either during migration, particularly. So I know that there are reports of piping plovers that show up in the Illinois River Valley, especially, you know, when the water levels are low. You know, a lot of these sandy rivers tend to become decent shorebird habitat. And while you're not going to find a piping plover nesting there, it's not unlikely to find one, you know, stopping over there, getting a bite before it moves on to its next location.
Yeah. And there's a lot of really great resources now. If you're able to get photos of any birds, really, you can go and ask anybody. I mean, there's a Facebook group that's literally just for you to put your photo of a bird and ask what it is, and they can help you at least identify it, and you'll know what you have.
Yeah, it's a big community.
Yeah, so getting photos or a good description is always really helpful. And, you know, there's a lot of us in the birding community that I have tons of friends that just say, hey, I saw this thing, it kind of looked like this, and then we can usually help at least identify it if there's a good enough description or a photo.
Anybody else have any questions that they want to ask?
We've got all day.
Yeah,
no, we don't.
I have just like, we'll wait a little bit, but we might end a little early. I think this is super interesting. But do you guys want to, we just talked about piping plovers a lot. I know birders have a lot of cool stories. Why don't you both share your best non-plover story that you really want to tell us? Or just a non-plover story.
Darn, on the spot.
I know there's other birds in your life.
There are. So this one's probably, I don't know if this is my best story. I mean, I've chased a lot of birds around the country, especially really rare birds. So those are always obviously like the best stories. I think it's funnier sometimes to explain like how deranged maybe we are in the way that we view. So I think to me, this is one story I told, I think a couple years ago, or I don't even know now, but I think what was funny is one of the, I would say the quote unquote rarest birds that I've chased in the Chicago region was on the south side. So there was a day where a few of us went down to, I'm going to blank on I think it's Beaubien Woods. It's right off the highway. It's not a place necessarily a destination place to go birding or anything, but you go down there and we're looking for a specific kind of bird and we're wandering around and I go one way and my friends go another direction and they call me and they're like, oh my gosh, we have it. It's over here. And I'm running around getting back over there and then we can't find it. And I was like, no, like I need this bird for my Chicago list. And I have already seen many of these birds, but for my Chicago Cook County list, this is the bird I need. And finally we get eyes on it. It's a wild turkey. So wild turkey to us was like this really rare thing in the Chicago region, but I grew up in Michigan. So like I've seen fields of 50, but sometimes we're just so crazy about like, we got to get this on my list for Cook County, for my Illinois list, my United States. I think that's the part that makes sometimes some of the crazy birders, like I guess me, sound insane when I'm like, oh, we found a turkey. Like it was so cool. You know, I've seen a lot of other rare birds, but you know, that was one I still needed just a few years ago.
I don't have a story quite like that, but this is always a fun one to share because it's just so like, dope. But I started bird watching when I was a little kid, it you know, it became a thing. Everybody kind of understood that that was what I did, and my grade school teachers were usually pretty understandings of it. And there were these walks in particular that I used to go to every Wednesday morning, like religiously. That's where I, you know, learned how to be a birder. And they always cut a little bit into the school hours. I would always end up on Wednesday mornings during migration, end up getting to school about an hour or so after start time. And I never really asked for permission. I kind of just did. And my teacher was pretty cool with it. She was like, I have to grumble at you because that's my job, but also I don't care. There was one time when she did though, because this is just, you know, at this point it's a norm, it's a thing. And then I just totally forgot that this one particular Wednesday, this was when we were doing standardized testing. This was ISAT day. And I show up to school just like normal, you know, late self, and after a morning of birding, and the principal greets me at the door. I'm like, what happened? I had totally forgotten it was testing. And of course, everybody's in the classroom doing their tests, and it has to be quiet, so I can't go join my classroom. So I'm sitting in the principal's office for like several hours, where I'm supposed to be writing down, you know, how I messed up and why I regret it. The funny thing about it is that I didn't regret it, and they later did the makeup test, and I not only did great, but I did better than everybody else in my class at the test. And my teacher later was like, yeah, I wasn't concerned. Totally worth it though.
I feel like that sounds like me at lunchtime at the zoo nowadays, where like I come back like run back for like a meeting, and I was like, sorry, I found something cool, and I was like looking at it. So
oh my gosh, that's so awesome. I just sorry. And one last item, we're not getting other things, but you guys just want to give, I know a lot of people are getting outside right now, just a brief tip or two about places to go in the fall that you'd recommend, and then we'll close this, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if any of y'all have heard about Big Marsh Park on the southeast side of Chicago, that's a fantastic spot to go to. I mean, it's fantastic for birds, but it's also just a phenomenal habitat for all kinds of other wildlife. There's like a bike park there. There's a brand new nature center going in there. I know it's not open yet due to COVID things, but that nature center is now complete. And I mean, the big thing obviously right now, if you're still trying to go out and social distance, is that it is a very expansive park and the trails are very wide. So if you go there, it's very easy to have a great time, see a lot of cool wildlife, and avoid people easily.
yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a good one. I feel like the other underrated one on the south side is like, especially like Rainbow Beach, Park 566, which is this sort of stretch that's being restored right now and has some great like grassland birds, and that kind of stretches between Rainbow all the way to Steelworkers. There's a little bit of private property in between, but it's a nice walk. There's usually a lot less people that go there, and can be some really great birds, and you can actually see like Lake Michigan through that whole walk. So if there's any cool birds out there, that's another one that I always think gets overlooked. And Calumet Park, you know, I just kind of drive through there sometimes and check out like what birds are hanging out in the fields.
Yeah, another
on the
really
beaches.
big space.
Yeah, especially in the fall, it's some really, really cool place to go and hang out. I want to make sure too that I don't know if we really officially did this, but like we obviously, I know there's probably some people on this call too that were volunteer plover monitors, and like we fully appreciate and thank all of you guys as well. I know it was like, especially this year was crazy, so none of this would be really successful without all of those people volunteering. So I want to make sure to thank them at least more officially. Yeah.
Applause to all of you.
Well, yeah, why don't you, like anybody, if you know how to use the reactions, maybe like put a thumbs up if you're somebody that was involved. See if you
if you help volunteer.
I know I see some people on here. It's just
Yeah.
the reaction button.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Sarah, Judy,
Yeah.
Amy Lerner, nice. Yeah, I see you
Yeah.
guys. We see you. We see you.
Awesome. Well, again, we really appreciate your putting this together. We're going to have this available on our website, but also youtube.com/islandbyrose, our YouTube channel, where you can see any of these. Actually, in a couple of weeks, I think on September 30th, using the same link, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be about shoreline erosion. So very complementary topic to this. You know, we're excited about it. Doing a few more of these to end the year, just making sure that our community is connected and we're level setting on all of these issues. So we really appreciate, again, both of you, Edward and Matt, for speaking. And if you go through the chat, you can check out places where you can follow these groups on social media. You can look at their websites. You can donate, become a member. Get involved. And of course, islandbyro.org/donate is IEC's page to become a member, as we advocate on behalf of all of these groups at the city, county, state level. So again, thank you all so much for joining, and enjoy your afternoon. So thanks everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having
Bye.
us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Bye.
I see you guys.